Have you ever taken a job that felt too good to be true? What if it came with a paycheck that could change your life, but also with a shadow that could end it? Tonight, I'm going to take you deep into the story of one woman, desperate for a fresh start, who stumbled into a nightmare she never saw coming. What started as a simple caretaker role at a remote site turned into something far darker. Strange sounds, unseen figures, and a horrifying presence that may not let her leave alive. Stay with me, because this is a story you won't want to face alone. If you're enjoying this story and love diving into the unknown, don't forget to subscribe to Next Story. Here, we bring you the most chilling tales of horror, mystery, and the unexplained. Hit the like button, share with your friends, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that will keep you up at night. Your support helps us bring you even more spine-tingling content. Now let's get back to the story. I thought this job sounded too good to be true. I might have been right. If I'm being honest, when I applied for this job a few weeks ago, I didn't really have much hope of it going anywhere. I don't think that it's unreasonable to assume that any position that offers almost $10 an hour above the award rate for a similar role and advertises no qualifications or previous experience required is either a hoax that was going to result in me selling diarrhea shakes door to door, or is going to be filled within minutes of being listed. But my husband, Eric, hadn't found any work in 6 months, and my own takings from 3 weekly shifts at a retail chain weren't doing a lot to replenish our dwindling savings, so I was willing to try just about anything. It was because of this that I had received my call back from the employer just a few hours after applying, with a mixture of nervousness and barely restrained hope. The woman on the other end of the line introduced herself as Sarah and asked if I was free for a brief interview and potential induction the following day. I told her that yes, I certainly was, and asked if she was able to give me any further information about the position, as the description in the ad had only read, week on, week off security, caretaker position at remote site. Meals and accommodation provided. Sarah informed me that I would be filled in on all the details the following day, and proceeded to hang up rather abruptly. I shrugged off her elusiveness regarding the details, as I was still open to the possibility that this could be some kind of scam, or hopefully, that it was a legitimate job that just required a level of discretion. I've worked in security before, and this wasn't too unusual a practice for a lot of places. The next morning, I headed to the address that Sarah had given me. It was a fairly nondescript 2-story office block in a semi-industrial part of town. A metal panel next to the front door gave the company name, which perhaps I shouldn't say here, but suffice to say it wasn't anything particularly unusual. I did serve to alleviate some of my concerns that this was some kind of direct sales scam, as it all looked pretty legitimate. A young woman greeted me at the front desk, took my details, and directed me to take a seat and assured me that someone would be with me shortly. She was correct in that before I had managed to sit down, a man who was probably not named Sarah opened a door to my left and motioned me inside. He shook my hand and introduced himself as Rodney. He was a tall man, probably in his mid-60s, with a thick gray mustache and long, wiry limbs that seemed to sit at odds with the hint of a beer gut that slouched over his tightly belted black combat pants. When he spoke, his accent had a distinct Eastern European lilt that I am far too poorly traveled and Australian to identify. It became clear pretty quickly that this wasn't to be a drawn-out, sit-down interview. Rodney brusquely made copies of my resume and ID while explaining the job to me in efficient verbal bullet points. I would be taking care of a decommissioned government site. It was in an area of bushland approximately 4 hours north. The shifts were 12 hours long. I would be responsible for the night shifts, while Rodney worked the days. Another team came in after a week and relieved us. After another week, we were to rinse and repeat. When I asked Rodney if this meant I had gotten the job, since we seemed to have skipped the interview entirely, he told me yes. The position needed to be filled as soon as possible, and I would need to start pretty much immediately. He told me that the company was happy enough to hire me based on my resume, and that if I signed my contract and accompanied him to a site induction that day, I would begin the following Monday, My surprise at the quick turnaround was far outweighed by my joy at landing the gig that I figured might just save my husband and I from financial ruin, and after excusing myself to briefly give him a call, I can't pretend that I didn't bust out a few fist pumps and silent screams of excitement. Our situation had been pretty dire for a while. Eric had been earning a good salary for a few years before he lost his job, but we hadn't been the most prudent with savings or spending our money conservatively, so we have a lot of debt. For this reason, when I called him, Eric was also overjoyed and encouraged me, provided I was happy to take it. It was with that I found myself chugging along in the passenger seat of a company-branded white ute alongside Rodney. The long drive was fairly uneventful, and while we made some pleasant small talk, it became apparent pretty quickly that Rodney was much of a talker. That was just fine by me. I was never the most social person anyway. 3/4 of the way into our journey, Rodney motioned to a turnoff that he explained lead to the closest town to the site. Apparently it consisted of a pub and a small grocery store and very little else, and likely wasn't worth making the trip to in my off hours in case I was wondering. Half an hour further down the road, we pulled over so that he could show me the off-site accommodation. It was surprisingly large, with enough beds and big enough of a mess hall for at least 30 people. Rodney explained that it had previously housed the majority of the workers from when the site had been open, and that it was just cost-effective to use it as our own accommodation rather than build more. As we were leaving, another company ute pulled into the site, and a heavy-set, tired and serious-looking woman nodded briefly at Rodney before heading inside. Rodney told me her name was Gina, and that she worked the opposing week's night shift. 30 more minutes on the road brought us to a large metal gate. It looked old, rusted in places, but sturdy for the most part. It stretched off into the dense scrub on both sides, making its length hard to guess at. Rodney spoke into a crackly intercom that was propped on a pole by the driver's side window, and after a few seconds the gates slowly opened. It was prettier than I expected. Tall, crooked ghost gums filtered and softened the sunlight. Native wildflowers and grasses carpeted the edges of the old, worn-down road thickly, and I could hear bird calls all over the place. I spotted a pair of honey-eaters flitting around, hopping from branches to parts of the fence, probably searching for bugs. Here and there I could spot remains of the facility, a half-destroyed wall here, a section of plumbing pipe there. As we traveled further in, more of what must have once been a fairly large operating site became apparent. As the trees thinned out, I could see a secondary fenced-off area off to the right. It looked to house a maze of sunken corridors with sun-faded yellow ladders leading down. To the left was a small cluster of concrete buildings, all several stories tall, the afternoon light revealing floors carpeted with dry and dead leaves that must have blown in through the empty sockets of smashed windows. The further we drove, the more the road below us degraded until the gravel had given way to impacted dirt. We soon came to a wide wooden bridge, stretched over a concrete valley that was probably 5 meters across. Next to the bridge was a metal catwalk, following the same path to the other side. Rodney stopped the car here. We can't take vehicles any further than this. The bridge might have been cleared to bear a car back during operational days, but it isn't worth taking the risk now. I asked Rodney how we were to get around the site, and he explained that there was a golf buggy at the guardhouse, or that I could take patrols on foot if I wanted the exercise. We stepped out of the car and crossed the catwalk. We now stood on what looked something like a large concrete island, surrounded by the moat on all sides. Several more metal catwalks traversed the area, many of which that led to and around the largest building I had seen so far, a flat metal building the size of a small airplane hangar. Portions of the walls and roof had rusted away, revealing the iron bones beneath. It had no windows, and from where I stood, I could not see a door. On the far corner of the island sat a much smaller and newer-looking structure. It was a portable unit, the kind you might see used as an office at a building site. A short Indian man in a very bright blue polo stepped out of it. He waved cheerily at us and started walking in our direction. We met him halfway and he introduced himself as Pat. He had the biggest grin and the whitest teeth I had ever seen on anyone outside of TV, and didn't seem to have the ability to stand still for more than a few seconds. He ushered us back to new-looking building, which he referred to as the hut. I stepped inside and was pleasantly surprised to find a very comfortable workspace. It was comprised of 2 rooms. The front room had a small kitchenette, a couple of cozy-looking chairs, and an old but seemingly functional TV set. Pat had what looked like one of the Fast and the Furious movies playing, which he switched off bashfully as he offered us tea and coffee. The second room was more like what I expected. It was smaller and consisted on a desk backed by a large plexiglass window that looked out across the other side of the concrete moat. There was a computer and CCTV system hooked up on the desk. I looked at the grid of black and white video screens. They showed 9 different views around the site. Most looked to be up high, cameras on poles, I supposed. The majority were facing the perimeter fence, but a few were focused on the interior areas, one on the hangar-sized building I had seen earlier, one on the maze of sunken corridors, and one, I noticed, was of the top of my own head. I looked up to see the camera that pointed at the desk, perched above the door in from the other room. Rodney noticed my staring. "Compliance," he said. "We have to be able to show the site owners that we are in here watching the cameras for a decent amount of time and not sleeping. Not that that stops anyone." Pat made a nervous squeak and busied himself with the buttons on his shirt. Rodney grinned at me. We went through the basics of what I would need to do when I worked. Keep an eye on the camera. Make patrols every few hours. They didn't really have any problems in a place this far out, but there was a bunch of copper wire around that was a theft risk. And there were a lot of steep drops and holes that a silly urbex twat might fall down if they managed to get in, so they needed someone around to prevent that. All in all, it didn't seem like a bad gig. A week on, week off of easygoing 12-hour night shifts making way more money than I could possibly hope to elsewhere seemed, in all honesty, like a blessing. I took the job without hesitation, and as we chugged back to civilization in the rumbly white ute, I don't think I could have felt luckier. 3 days later, I was ready to start my first official shift. I had arrived at the accommodation in the early afternoon, with instructions from Rodney to get some rest and to drive out to the site to meet him at 7 p.m. As I pulled up, I spotted Pat throwing a large black duffel bag into the back tray of one of the company utes. He stopped to shake my hand and told me that he and Gina were heading back home for their week off. It was then that I saw Gina sitting in the driver's seat. Her face was partially obscured by the shadow of the sun visor, but she seemed to be staring at me. I had never seen someone who looked more tired. Deep dark bags hung under her eyes and her skin looked almost gray. To tell you the spookiness to it, it was devoid of any of the normal sounds that you might be used to. Traffic and people and music, so even the smallest sound was amplified and seemed to jump out of the stark silence and clang around the inside of your head. There were definitely animals around, and every time I heard something scurry, my heart raced for a moment. All in all, though, the first night really wasn't that bad. It wasn't till the third night that things started to get a little strange. It was around 2 a.m. I remember because we had to make hourly notes in a little book in the office. I'd headed out in the buggy to make a patrol and was putting along past the area with the sunken corridors when I thought I saw something. A flash of movement, something darting near one of the yellow ladders that dropped down to the space below. I stopped the buggy and got out. My immediate thought was that it was a fox maybe, or a possum. As I said before, there was a lot of wildlife in the area, but I did have my concerns about the aforementioned urbex tuts, so I thought I should make a cursory check. I shone my light through the fence. It surrounded the whole area, so I could hardly get closer, a fact which, being my scaredy cat self, I wasn't terribly angry about. I saw nothing. I called out, "Hello?" I aimed for loud and gruff, trying to sound like I was a foot taller and a few arnies tougher than I actually was. Nothing. Its soft wind blowing through the grass and the occasional cricket. I was turning to leave when I heard it. Slapping. It was the sound of running across a scorching hot car park at the beach, bare feet on concrete. I swung around and shone my torch towards the corridors again. The light rippled over the shrubs and the cracked concrete and bounced against the metal of the faded yellow ladders, but I saw nothing. There was, however, no denying that the sound was coming from those sunken laneways. The tempo of the slaps was rising. I imagined whatever I could hear running faster and faster. Soon there was almost no break between the sounds, like whatever was in there was sprinting. I moved the torch around wildly. I was shouting now. "Hey!" I yelled. "Hey! You can't be in there!" Then, the cone of light from my torch caught something. Something moving. Whatever it was froze when the light caught it. It was pretty far back from where I stood. I couldn't make anything out, just a vague round shape. Could it be the top of someone's head? Someone running around in there? How had they even gotten in? I was about to say something to them when it started moving again. Slowly this time. Slap, slap, slap. It was definitely moving, slowly and deliberately along the corridor. The rounded shape that I assumed was the top of their hair moved in time with steps. Slap, slap, slap. I wanted to call out to them, tell them to come out. But I had started to feel real nervous. My voice caught in my throat as I traced their path with my torchlight. The edge of the beam caught the glint of one of the yellow ladders just ahead of the moving shape. Slap, slap, slap. They stopped at the ladder. The sound of its steps ceased and I saw the head bob a little. They looked like they were climbing up. My torch stayed trained on the ladder, and I strained my eyes to make out any clear shapes. It was just the movement at first, the first ladder rung that was really visible from the surface. A dark, grasping shape shooting up and curling around the rung, tensing to pull the weight of whatever was attached to it. I couldn't help myself. I felt like an animal being hunted. An immediate, palpable sense of danger overtook me and I flung myself into the buggy and hightailed it to the hut, locking the door behind me. For almost 10 minutes, I sat in one of the armchairs, shaking uncontrollably. My heart was racing and my mouth felt like it was full of sand. I made tea, and as I sat, clinging to the warm cup, I eventually regained some of my composure. And immediately, I felt very stupid. There could well have been someone running around in there, and what had I, the person who was being paid to keep people from doing exactly that, done about it? Freaked out and bolted? And now I had wasted another 10 minutes freaking out. It was time to do some damage control. I started by texting Rodney. "Sorry to bother you, mate, but I think I might have spotted someone in the fenced-off area. Is there a key around so I can have a closer look?" Yelled out, but they didn't respond. He replied almost immediately. "Highly unlikely, not easy to get in there. We don't have regular access to those keys, but check the CCTV footage to see if anyone snuck in. Call police if break-in." I went to the back office and ran through the footage. Nothing seemed to have breached the perimeter fenced, but I checked a few times, to be sure. The only thing I saw was my dumbass self freaking out and driving off. The camera quality isn't great, but I could see that in the least. I definitely couldn't see anything moving around in the maze from the cameras. By the time I was done checking the footage, the sun was up. I patrolled again and saw nothing, and I resolved that I had just seen an animal running around and freaked out like an idiot. I was feeling a lot better by the time Rodney arrived for his shift. We chatted briefly. I assured him that nobody seemed to have gotten in last night, but I was surprised that we weren't able to access the fenced-off area. Rodney explained that that area wasn't safe, so we didn't go in there regularly. He seemed pretty terse, so I decided not to press him for any more. I didn't sleep so well that day. I had rationalized that nothing unusual had actually happened, but the fear hung around anyway. That brief moment where I had felt like prey came back in flashes that jolted me back from the edge of sleep, and I felt like a zombie when I arrived for that night's shift. The next few nights were uneventful, and I gradually returned to sleeping properly in my time off. It wasn't until the night before I was due to leave for the week that things got bad again, and it was what happened here that has me questioning whether I should return. I'd only been working a few hours. It was 10:30 or so. I was reading a book in the CCTV room and debating about whether or not. I was ready to get up and microwave the frozen curry I had bought with me for dinner. I'd decided to have a thorough look over the cameras for a few minutes first. Then I could justify eating tea before needing to do another patrol. It had been an unseasonably cold night, and I had very little desire to go outside at all. I flicked through the screens. Grainy image after grainy image, seeing nothing of interest at the perimeter. I took a while to pause at the camera that was focused on me. Since I had started seeing myself on this camera, I'd become convinced that I had a bald patch that only seemed to be perceptible at this one specific angle, and it was fast becoming a growing obsession of mine. I was tilting my head back and forth, trying to catch the hint of shine that would betray a bare patch of scalp when I saw it. The plexiglass window behind me was normally just a bare patch of darkness at this time of night. Any light from indoors seemed to just bounce off it, or perhaps was just absorbed by the dense blackness. But now something moved in the blackness behind me. At first I thought it was just a strange distortion of my own reflection. But while I was sitting stock still, whatever this was swaying, slowly from side to side. I squinted at the computer screen. The shape was humanoid, the light grayish shape of a head and shoulders against the pitch black behind it. It continued to sway. I felt my stomach in my throat. My mind was scrabbling, trying to justify whatever this was as a trick of the light, a distortion on the camera, anything that wasn't some thing standing behind me, watching me through the window. I saw my own face on the screen. Eyes wide and face pale, I was staring at myself, in an infinite loop of pant-shitting terror. I flicked desperately through the cameras, trying to find one that would give me another view of whatever was outside without me needing to turn and look at it, to confirm to whoever or whatever it was that I knew it was there. But they were no help. I cycled through again, but knew that none showed the back of the hut. I clicked back to the camera that showed me in the office, and I screamed. Well, at least I tried to. My voice had again abandoned me, and all that escaped my throat was a soft, gasping whistle. The thing was in the office. It was standing right behind me. I sat frozen in place, unable to move, unable to wrench my eyes away from the screen. It was tall enough that it had to hunch down to avoid its head scraping the ceiling. Long wisps of light-colored hair hung down from the sides of its head, obscuring the details of its face. Long, crooked-looking arms were spread out awkwardly at its side, swaying independently of the rest of its body. Its torso was mostly covered by the terror-stricken dude that sat directly in front of it. But what I could see of it was gray, mottled-looking, and in no way human. It didn't have a solid body, at least, not completely solid. Its flesh branched and separated and wove back together, like twisted tree roots or an enormous Celtic knot. Through the gaps in its torso, I could make out pieces of the wall and widow behind it. It hadn't moved. Not toward me anyway. It just stood there, area swaying, head and neck hunched. I couldn't turn around. Somehow I knew that turning around would mean death. It would allow the thing standing behind me to attack. All I could do was stare at the camera feed, stare at the thing behind me and my own fear-stricken face. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen and waiting. I don't know if I just closed my eyes or if just somehow, impossibly fell asleep, because one moment the thing was there, and the next, it was gone. The time on the computer in front of me read 0500, and daylight was filtering through the window. I didn't move a muscle until it was 5 minutes to 7, and I knew Rodney would be pulling up out by the bridge. And with that, I grabbed my bag and basically sprinted to meet him. I somehow managed to get through 30 seconds of pleasantries with him, and proceeded to gun the ute out of there, feeling better with every meter I put between myself and that place. I couldn't put together in my mind the incomprehensible and impossible events that had happened to me. It couldn't be real. Was it a nightmare? Was I going insane? Is this some kind of elaborate and fucked up trick they play on newbies here? This is what I ruminated on as I waited at the accommodation for Pat and Gina to come relieve us for the week. They would come there first, before Gina would head out for the night shift. When they arrived, I was sitting in a chair on the front patio staring off into space. Pat welcomed me with a hand on my shoulder, jerking me from my stupor and making me jump out of my chair. The insanely energetic man sprang back like a jack in the box. "Sorry, mate. Hi, how was your week?" I gave him a brief reply and picked up my bag, eager to start loading my things into the car and get out of there. I was so focused on doing so that I walked straight into Gina. She steadied me with a large, ruddy hand. I looked up at her, noting that she looked far less tired than last time I had seen her. "You coming back?" she asked. It was the first time I had heard her speak. I said nothing. She stared at me. While the bags under her eyes were gone, they still looked hollow, sad. They go away if you shut your eyes, sometimes. I looked up at this. What was she referring to when she said they? I began to ask her, but she was hurrying off to the ute. Her shift started soon. Before I knew it, she was just a cloud of red dirt in the distance. The journey back with Rodney was quiet. He was tired and I was confused, I guess. He dropped me home and said he would see me in a week. That was 3 days ago. If I'm not going back, I'm going to need to tell him. But fuck, we really need that money, and I don't even really know what I saw. I've searched online and found nothing. I don't know where to go next. My husband knows something's up, but I can't tell him. He would make my mind up for me and tell me not to go back. I'm just at a loss, I suppose. All I know is that I need to make my mind up soon, and I can't fucking sleep anymore. And that's where her story ends. Or does it? What do you think? Was it all in her head? Or is there something truly sinister lurking in the shadows of that abandoned site? Let us know your theories in the comments below. Your thoughts might just unlock the next chilling mystery. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.